One of the best aspects of following a long-running television show is seeing how the characters change over time. I love watching how the events from previous episodes and seasons force the characters that we know and love to change their worldviews and how they act, and seeing how that affects the world and people around them. But when it comes to portraying realistic growth, Bojack Horseman is simply on another level compared to any other television show that I've watched in full. And since personal growth is such a focal point on the show, it makes sense that the show writes character growth with a level of nuance that transcends everyday media. Most media is actually pretty simple in this regard when you really think about it. You start with a character, you have them go through a character arc, and then after said arc, the character changes in a certain way. And this is the norm that we've become accustomed to when it comes to narratives, but in real life, meaningful change is never this easy. We wish it was, but growth isn't as straightforward as it is in our favorite stories. Real change isn't always simple or pretty or linear, and I love how Bojack Horseman has a very realistic portrayal of growth. And thus, it goes without saying that this video contains spoilers for the show if you haven't seen it already, and spoilers for the following as well. And with that, the first step to growth is to acknowledge your imperfections. One of the hardest aspects of growing is admitting that you're not where you want to be just yet. To want to grow means swallowing your pride and embracing the discomfort that comes with being a work in progress. And of course, there are a ton of reasons why a person may not want to grow, but in Bojack, we're shown quite a few. And the first reason is ego. Like I said, the first step to growth is to acknowledge your imperfections. It means that you don't like a part of yourself enough to want to change it. And the titular Bojack Horseman is a clear example of this. At the start of the series, we see that he's absolutely content with just sitting on his couch, rewatching Horsing Around episodes and reliving his prime. But he also needs to write a memoir, and that's pretty difficult when he doesn't want to acknowledge his flaws, much to the chagrin of his publisher, Pinky Penguin, and ghostwriter, Diane. In fact, the whole plot of Season 1 revolves around trying to write a realistic illustration of Bojack's life. But he doesn't want people to know about the truth behind the Horseman. He doesn't want people to know that he's broken and traumatized and had a rough childhood. He wants people to look at him and believe that he's perfect and beloved like the character that he portrayed in the 90s, not the hollow, depressed Bojack Horseman. And it's his ego that blinds him to his imperfections and why he keeps looking for things to blame instead of taking accountability for his mistakes.
So what you're saying is, everything is society's fault, and we as individuals never need to take responsibility for anything.
No, not exactly. I was just saying that...
I like that.
Bojack's ego in the earlier seasons is what lets him be comfortable living in his delusion that he's perfect and has no need for growth. But there's actually another character that I want to talk about who has a big ego that prevents them from growing. And ironically, it's Diane. Diane is the show's moral compass, but her self-righteousness and idealism is also her own downfall. She believes that the world should be a certain way and holds reality to the impossible standard of what she deems is correct. Throughout most of the show, Diane is a moral purist, with a black and white sense of idealism in a world that's full of different shades of gray. It's only when she accepts that the world is broken that she stops trying to fix everything. And then she learns to be comfortable with her own imperfections. And actually, that's another word that I want to focus on. Comfortable. Another reason why people don't want to grow is because they're comfortable. If a character is completely content with the way their life works, they don't have any reason to change the status quo. We see this with Bojack in the earlier episodes, but we also see this in Todd, Bojack's alleged best friend, who's perfectly content with being a couch surfer with an alternative lifestyle. But it can also be argued that Todd stays the way he is because he fears responsibility. But that on his own is much better exhibited by a different character, ironically, Princess Carolyn. Princess Carolyn was initially afraid to start her own agency and take the leap going from agent to executive. Some characters fear growth because it brings with it new changes, like new responsibilities, more expectations, and a higher standard that we may or may not live up to. And this is something that's true in real life as well. Not everyone is a bag chaser trying to climb the career ladder and get a better paycheck as fast as possible. Of course, it's weird to use Princess Carolyn as an example here, as she is practically the poster child for hustle culture on the show, but the point is that even she is afraid of growth at some point, despite her ultimately thriving in her new role. Her being afraid to take the next step shows that sometimes growth is a gamble, and we have to accept that taking a leap of faith may also end up with us falling flat on our faces. Because sometimes even facing potential failure can be better than staying where you are. And speaking of, that's the last reason I want to mention that prevents people from acknowledging their need for growth. Sometimes people just aren't self-aware enough to acknowledge that they need to grow, like with Mr. Peanut Butter. Throughout the show, we get to see how Mr. Peanut Butter isn't the best husband to Diane, and it's shown that he's a pretty bad husband in general, having 3 failed marriages, with a 4th deteriorating at a much faster pace than before. But he's not nasty or wicked in the way that Bojack can be. He just seriously lacks self-awareness and is almost maliciously ignorant. And it's why sometimes we need other people to keep ourselves in check. Every single main character has a block preventing them from growing, and only when that block is challenged does the character exhibit growth. Diane faces her ego and learns to accept the world as it is, finding comfort in imperfection. Todd desires to live with Maud and have a relationship with his mother, making him discontent and letting him move forward as a character to achieve what he wants. Princess Carolyn faces her fear of maybe not being good enough and thrives as an executive. And finally, Mr. Peanut Butter just realizes he's in a broken pattern and takes the necessary steps to fix it. And at some point in the story, Bojack actually exhibits each and every one of these growth blocks. But another thing I like about the show is that growth doesn't end after you conquer a growth block. Because growth isn't a singular act, it is a conscious choice that we make over and over again.
It gets easier.
Huh?
Every day it gets a little easier.
Yeah?
But you gotta do it every day. That's the hard part. But it does get easier.
Okay.
This is probably one of the most quoted scenes in the show, and in just a handful of words perfectly encapsulates that personal growth is a choice. But it's not presented as a single pivotal choice like in a video game, but as a choice you have to choose over and over again. You don't get to live your life as a bad person and then wake up one day and decide that you're not that person anymore. In the season premiere of Bojack's second season, Bojack has apparently started a new life. The episode starts off with him being much happier and more motivated now that he's won an award, coming off the heels of the previous season. And you would think that after watching him in this first episode that he's finally going to be a better person, but he's unfortunately the same old Bojack that does some pretty horrible things in this season. He still mistreats Todd and downplays his success in improv, which is something that he's incredibly passionate about. He purposefully burns $1 million that would have gone to charity because his ego was stepped on. He doesn't reach out to Kelsey after she gets fired from Secretariat, making the exact same mistake he did with Herb, showing that he didn't actually learn from the events of the telescope, and not to mention grooms a teenager and nearly has sex with her, which is, in the simplest way I can put it, not something that a good person would do. Again, all of this happens after Bojack claims to have grown. But real growth is about consistency. Being nice one day and acting like that makes you a better person, while being horrible again the next day and the days after that doesn't mean you've grown. It means you had a good day. And if your bad days still outweigh your good ones, then you've still got a long ways to go when it comes to growth. Because the purpose of growth isn't to absolve you of wrongdoings. And I love how the show challenges the notion that being self-aware of your mistakes means that you're worthy of forgiveness, or even that forgiveness is something that people are entitled to. In episode 8 of season 1, The Telescope, we see Bojack visit Herb after what feels like a lifetime of the two not speaking. We know that Bojack had done Herb dirty by not standing up for him, and also by not contacting him for years after Herb was kicked from horsing around. We see that Bojack had finally grown enough to the point where he feels he's ready to face Herb. And I love how Herb just doesn't forgive Bojack. He takes this to his damn grave. Herb dies without absolving Bojack of his sins, and Bojack has to live with that for the rest of his days. And this is a scene that really stands out to me because it really sends the message that nobody is entitled to forgiveness. And this is a problem I have with a lot of modern media, particularly media aimed at children. I think that some works of fiction are obsessed with making sympathetic villains when they really should be completely irredeemable. For example, in the show Steven Universe, they try to humanize the Diamonds, who are, if you are unfamiliar with the show, ruthless, militaristic despots whose inhumane acts include, but are not limited to, experimentation on sentient beings, merging them to create some sort of super weapon, establishing an oppressive authoritarian regime that murdered those who opposed them, colonized and destroyed entire planets, resulting in the conquest of worlds and mass genocide. But Steven still tries to get them to change and see the error in their ways, and shows them compassion as he believes that nobody is beyond redemption. The same goes for Lord Shen from Kung Fu Panda 2. He murders an entire race, and on top of that the main character's mother, to escape a prophecy that would end up with him in shambles. And Po still tries to give him a speech about redemption and second chances. While I admire the intention of showing that it's never too late as a message to children, I do think that these examples are problematic, as they can be misinterpreted as you can do horrible things and still be deserving of forgiveness. And that's exactly how Bojack thinks in The Telescope. He thinks he can face Herb after not standing up for him in his time of need and not contacting him for years and come out with a clear conscience. He thinks that after all of this time that he's worthy of forgiveness just because he showed up one day out of the blue after he finds out that Herb has cancer. Another example of how the show doesn't portray growth as a silver bullet for your mistakes is pretty much the entirety of season 6. In this season, we finally get a Bojack that has his act together. He's finding fulfillment in being an acting teacher. He's clean from his vices, and it seems that he's got a good trajectory in life for once. But while we're seeing this, his big mistakes from the previous season start slowly creeping up on him, like dragging Sarah Lynn back down to her addictions and grooming and nearly sleeping with a teenager. And we get to see Bojack face the music. He loses his house. He's erased from his life's most important work. He loses the one familial connection he has left and is likely never going to work in Hollywood again. It's brutal what the show does to him after he finally got his act together, but I love how the show doesn't pull its punches when finally giving Bojack the consequences he earned through his many messed up actions. And it's these consequences that ultimately cause him to relapse. And let's talk about that. From a meta perspective, I think Bojack's relapse is one of the most important scenes in the show. Usually when we see a character relapse into their old tendencies, we see it as frustrating. We're mad at the character and the writers for wasting our time watching a character grow and then having it ultimately amount to nothing. One example that gets a lot of hate is Jaime Lannister from Game of Thrones. He went through a great character arc about learning how to be a good person and not pushing children out the window, only to go back to loving his twin sister and dying in her arms. Fans were undoubtedly frustrated with this, as they were with most of the events of Game of Thrones last season, but it does show a relapse, albeit very poorly. But Bojack's relapse is important because it shows relapse as a part of growth and not the death of it. See, Jaime's death is a direct consequence of his relapse. He rushes back to King's Landing to be with his sister and is crushed by debris because he chose to be with her instead of Brienne. Him relapsing literally costs him his life, portraying relapse as a grave mistake. And Bojack does this as well with Sarah Lynn, who dies after going on a bender after a long period of sobriety. In both of these examples, these characters die after a relapse. And this sends a message that is loud and clear. If you relapse after changing, you failed. Your life is over. Despite all your efforts, you will never be anything more. And that's a heartbreaking message that unfortunately has some truth to it. But realistically, that's not always how things go. For most people, trying to kick a bad habit like smoking isn't easy, and relapse will happen because they don't know how to deal with the withdrawal. But by having Bojack not die after relapsing while still facing consequences, for example going to prison, it shows the negative effects of relapse, but that life still goes on and that there's still a chance to be better. But it also makes sure to portray relapse as something to be avoided so as to not glorify the phenomenon. The series' penultimate episode, The View from Halfway Down, does this so beautifully by portraying Bojack's relapse as scary, unsettling, and incredibly disturbing. And the show puts it beautifully in the final conversation that Todd and Bojack have in the series finale.
What if I relapse again?
Then you'll get sober again. So that's what I'm talking about. It's like the song says. You do the hokey pokey and you turn yourself around. You turn yourself around. That's what it's all about.
And this makes the message loud and clear. Relapse is dangerous and ideally should be avoided. But if you really can't, that sucks, but you can still move forward from it. And that's a very hopeful message for anybody trying to improve their lives. It doesn't matter if you stumble a bit on your path to being a better person, but what's more important is that you turn yourself around and get back on track after you do. And I think that's beautiful. But growth isn't always beautiful. Usually in media, we get visual indications of a character's growth. It can be something as drastic as a new suit or a new hairstyle to illustrate to the audience that a character isn't the same as who they were before. But usually this is seen as an upgrade of sorts, something that improves the character's design. But I admire how Bojack's visual indicators for growth aren't the typical ugly duckling transformation that we've come to expect, because we know that that's not always the case. In season 6, Bojack stops coloring his hair and accepts his gray mane, something that men are typically insecure about. But a better example within the same show would be how Diane gains weight. See, we're conditioned to seeing gaining weight as a bad thing, and that overweight people are ugly. After all, being overweight is typically associated with being undisciplined and lazy. But Diane gains weight as a result of her taking her antidepressants religiously, and this ultimately leads her to leading a healthier life, no longer facing existential dread and being a lot more content. And I want to thank the writers for making such a nuanced, creative decision. Because growth isn't always a workout montage that results in a lower body fat percentage and six-pack abs, nor is it going from wearing shoes from Payless to wearing ones from Balenciaga. Growth can be a young woman building a better relationship with food and overcoming her eating disorder after being anorexic as a teenager. It can be a middle-aged man who stops wearing a wig and accepts his male pattern baldness. Growth isn't glitz and glamour. It isn't always pretty, but it is real. Just like the need to let go of certain things in the past. Because sometimes growth means letting go. And we see this at the end of the show, not necessarily with Bojack, but with the people he was closest to. By the end of the show, Todd almost entirely stops hanging out with Bojack, very rarely sharing any scenes together. We saw that Todd was much better off without Bojack in his life, having a real job and being able to have meaningful romantic relationships. While Todd does meet Maud, his best relationship by far, through Bojack's intervention, they're still better off with distance between themselves. Princess Carolyn, who spent the entire show putting out Bojack-induced fires either as his agent or manager, refuses to go back to working with him, and of course Diane presumably has one more conversation with Bojack on the roof, and they never speak another word to each other ever again. Every other character in the show goes on their own respective journeys and finds themselves growing away from Bojack, choosing to stop associating with him in some way for the betterment of themselves. And that represents the painful reality that sometimes it's the people that we're closest to that hold us back from who we're meant to become. Sometimes, and perhaps even unknowingly, we let people in our lives drag us down and prevent us from growing because we're familiar with them. We may have friends who we're constantly cleaning up after, or family members who still try to mold us into something we're not. They're toxic to us, but we keep them around because that's what we're familiar with. But growth can sometimes mean breaking apart the shackles that people place on us even when they're the closest connections we have. And that's what the rest of the characters do. They all cut Bojack out because even after everything they've been through, they're all better off without him.
I think there are people that help you become the person that you end up being, and you can be grateful for them, even if they were never meant to be in your life forever. I'm glad I knew you too.
And if you liked the video, why not leave a like and a comment and hit that subscribe button. Every bit of engagement helps the channel out and allows me to continue making video essays just like this one. Check out my other videos if you want more content from me, and I'll see you in the next one.